I'll be going over the torso model and everything you need to know for the final practical exam. So the first salivary gland, which we can see here, lies on the outside of the cheek, and this is the parotid gland. Parotid gland, that's P-A-R-O-T-I-D, parotid gland. Now, if I look at the other side, there's a little salivary gland here called the submandibular gland. And that should make sense because this is the mandible and it lies under the mandible. We have a third salivary gland, which is not visible in this model, and that's the sublingual gland. That's the third and final salivary gland that we have. So moving down the surface of our model a little bit here, here we see the hyoid bone. All right, the hyoid bone is the only unarticulated bone in the body, the hyoid bone. From here to here would be the larynx, the larynx. Now the larynx is where we have the vocal cords. Now what we're seeing here in blue is actually called the thyroid cartilage of the larynx. Thyroid cartilage of the larynx. Okay, and the larynx is from here to here behind these muscles. Inferior to the larynx, once I get to here, I see these ridges, or rings I should say rather. These are the cartilaginous rings of the trachea. Okay, the cartilaginous rings of the trachea. And right here, I see the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland right here. Yeah. Let's start pulling some stuff out here so we can get a better view at the internal organs. And so let's take this breastplate off here and let's identify these organs. So here I see the top portion of the esophagus. The esophagus. So the pharynx is the throat, and the pharynx is going to connect to the esophagus and to the trachea. It's going to bifurcate. This is why we can choke on stuff, right? If I were to open this up, this is actually the glottis, where the vocal cords are. Right here, we have the epiglottis. The epiglottis, when we swallow, this epiglottis is going to fold down and cover the airways so that we don't choke on our food. This is the glottis, which has the vocal cords. Once I get to here, where these rings are, that's where I get to the trachea, So this entire region is the larynx. This portion here is the thyroid cartilage of the larynx. And back here is the cricoid cartilage of the larynx. So I should note, this is the trachea, this is the larynx. Well, what about this part? This is actually part of the esophagus that you're seeing here. So in front we have the trachea, and behind we've got the esophagus. I'm just going to go over all the organs real quick, and then we're going to get more detailed. All right, so most notably, we have the heart. Okay, and remember, left and right are switched. It's mirror image. It's the right and left of the model or of the patient. So this is the right lung and the left lung. This is the diaphragm. This is the principal muscle for respiration, the diaphragm. This is the liver, the stomach. All this in gray is the colon, and all this in yellow is the small intestine. So now that we have an overview, let's zoom in a little bit and get some more detail. Okay, so now we have a much better view. This is the esophagus. This is the trachea. This is the heart. Okay, this is the aorta. This is the superior vena cava right here. This is the pulmonary trunk. Okay. And the superior vena cava is actually formed by the right brachiocephalic vein and left brachiocephalic vein merging together. So right and left brachiocephalic veins. Brachio means arm. Cephalic means head. So that means blood coming from the head, neck, and right arm is going to come through the right brachiocephalic vein. Similarly, blood from the left side of the head and neck and the left arm is going to go through the left brachiocephalic vein. The left and right brachiocephalic veins are going to merge together to form the superior vena cava, which leads to the right atrium, which is the main entrance to the heart. Right? Because the heart is a little bit off-center towards the left side, this means that the lungs are very different from one another. If you do have to have a lung injury, you want to hope that it's in the smaller lung, which is on the left side. Right? So the left lung is smaller, and it has only two lobes. It has the superior lobe and the inferior lobe. So superior lobe and inferior lobe of the left lung. Now what about the right lung? The right lung is considerably larger, and it has three lobes instead of two. This is the superior lobe of the right lung, the middle lobe of the right lung, and you can only see a portion of it until I take it out. This is the inferior lobe of the right lung. But now that I've taken it out, you can really see the difference. Okay, the superior lobe of the right lung, middle lobe of the right lung, and inferior lobe of the right lung. So superior vena cava, I can see more of that here. I can see the ascending aorta here and the pulmonary trunk here. So that's a much better view. All right, so I'm going to take the heart off. Now, as you might recall, the aorta has branches. So this is the ascending aorta, and then once I start getting to these branches, that's the aortic arch. And a lot of it is kind of obscured with this model. But I can ask you for the ascending aorta and for the thoracic aorta. So after the aortic arch, the aorta is going to turn and descend. At that portion, the whole thing is technically called the descending aorta, but I'd like you to be more specific. The portion of the descending aorta that is in the thoracic cavity is named the thoracic aorta, and that's here in red. Once it passes through the diaphragm, the thoracic aorta at that point becomes the abdominal aorta. So here we see the trachea, all right, which is part of the respiratory system. Now, the trachea, I can see a little bit of it right here, but right here it's going to bifurcate or split. And I don't see a whole lot because on that side, because it's actually stuck stuck on the back of this, which I won't ask you for it there. So, but this bifurcation, the trachea is going to split right here into the right and left primary bronchi. So these are the primary bronchi. Okay. So bronchi is plural, so if I just point here, you should answer the left primary bronchus. So US instead of I. So bronchi and bronchus. This is that thoracic aorta, and this is the esophagus. Okay, so the esophagus is going to continue to descend, and it's also going to go through the diaphragm, which is here. All right, so the aorta and the esophagus are going to go through the diaphragm. Remember, diaphragm is the principal muscle of respiration or breathing. I'm going to remove the diaphragm, so just so you know, that's what the diaphragm looks like. Should it come up on the practical exam by itself. Here I see the liver. This is the inferior vena cava. I've got the inferior vena cava is here, and it's also here. So, but this is the inferior vena cava that's coming from the liver. Now let's go ahead and remove the liver. So this is the liver. Right? This is somewhat how it's placed in the body. This is the inferior vena cava. This is the right lobe, and this is the left lobe. All right, I'm going to turn this around so we can see some additional structures. All right, so here's another view of the inferior vena cava. Now in green here, this structure is the gallbladder, the gallbladder. Now, in the digestive system, the function of the liver is to make bile. Bile functions to break down fat. What the gallbladder does is it takes the bile from the liver and it stores it and concentrates it. And it waits for a signal that really greasy pizza is on the way. Okay, so when it notices a high-fat meal is on the way to the stomach, that's when the gallbladder is going to secrete its specialized, extra concentrated bile that it has sitting around. We do have bile released from the gallbladder as well as the liver, but the gallbladder kind of is that specialty for high-fat content meals. Bile travels from the gallbladder through the cystic duct. That's S-Y-S-T-I-C, cystic duct. And bile from the liver is going to go through the common hepatic duct. Okay, here in green. Now, the common hepatic duct and the cystic duct are going to combine and merge together right here at this point to form the common bile duct. Now, the common bile duct is going to continue and it's going to go to the pancreas. From there, it gets mixed with pancreatic juices, which has tons of enzymes, and then it goes to the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, where most of the digestion actually occurs. There's two other things you might notice here. This is the proper hepatic artery, and this is the portal vein, or hepatic vein, or hepatic portal vein. Okay, all of those will work for me. All right, so here is the stomach. Here's part of the diaphragm. Here's part of the diaphragm. Here's the esophagus. Here's a continuation of the esophagus. And the esophagus is going to empty food into the stomach. Well, right here, there's a valve. So I could point to it here or here. Okay, that valve. This is the entranceway to the stomach, and it's called the cardiac valve or cardiac sphincter. Why does it have such a strange name? Well, if I put all this back together, now once you see them together, it's like, okay, I'll buy it. That's why they call it the cardiac valve or cardiac sphincter. Either is fine. So cardiac valve or cardiac sphincter. The exit to the stomach, and that's the pyloric valve or pyloric sphincter. And I could ask for it here or here. So let me point out just a couple of things before I get too much further. This whole structure here is the pancreas. The pancreas. And here we see that common bile duct. All right, so that's that bile coming from the liver and gallbladder. It's going to go to the pancreas after that. After the pancreas, it's going to go to this first part of the small intestine right here, which is the duodenum. We'll get a better view of that in just a moment. Here, we can see part of the right kidney. Okay, so this is the right kidney here. And this is just a portion of the left kidney in this model. This right here is the spleen. The spleen. So on the outside, I could point here for the pyloric valve or pyloric sphincter, cardiac valve or cardiac sphincter. When I open this up, this is the cardiac valve or cardiac sphincter and the pyloric valve or pyloric sphincter. How are you going to be able to tell which is which? What you want to do is you want to look for this bulge. See this bulge here? This bulge is called the fundus, F-U-N-D-U-S. Also sometimes called the fundic region, but on your answer key it just says fundus, and that's what it says. Fundic region would be the same thing. The main portion of this is actually the body of the stomach. The portion by the cardiac sphincter is the cardiac region. The region by the pyloric sphincter is the pyloric region. The main region is going to be the body of the stomach again. Now, if I point to the body of the stomach, but I ask about the ridges are called rugae, which is R-U-G-A-E, the rugae. The rugae allows for expansion of the stomach after a large meal. Next, let's go over the small intestine. The small intestine includes all of this, as well as this first portion of the small intestine here. The first portion of the small intestine is called the duodenum, and that goes from here to here. So the first place that food goes after the stomach is the duodenum. The duodenum, interestingly enough, is where most of the digestion, when we say digestion, we mean the breakdown of food. So not the absorption, but the breakdown of food, actual digestion, going to occur mostly here in the duodenum. And the reason for that is I've got bile going here, I've got pancreatic juices that are going there, so tons of enzymes and bile are working in this first portion of the small intestine to break down the food further. After the first portion of the small intestine, there's no real separation between the last two segments of the small intestine. So the first segment is the duodenum, and the second portion is the jejunum. Now the jejunum is going to be a little bit up here, and most of this here. Okay, so now I'm going to make it really obvious, and I'm going to point way over here if I'm asking for the jejunum of the small intestine. Now, the exit to the small intestine is going to be here. All right, that's going to be where it exits. So all around here is going to be the ileum, the I-L-E-U-M, ileum of the small intestine. All right, so the jejunum and the ileum. The jejunum is where most of the absorption of nutrients occurs. So that's when really you're absorbing nutrients from the food. It's passing through the walls of the small intestine and getting absorbed into the bloodstream for distribution. After the small intestine, we get to the colon. And in between, there's another valve, and this valve is right here. The first portion of the colon, aka large intestine, this first portion is called the cecum of the large intestine or colon. That's C-E-C-U-M, the cecum. This valve here is called the ileocecal valve. The ileocecal valve. All right, so this portion is the cecum. Okay, after the cecum, we get to the ascending colon. The ascending colon. Once I get about here, at this point, I'm close to the liver. They actually call this bend the hepatic flexure because of this bend, the hepatic flexure. And this portion here is the transverse colon, the transverse colon. So transverse colon until about here. At this point, the colon's going to turn and descend to form the descending colon. The descending colon. So this is all descending colon back here. And right here, I'm just getting to the next portion of the large intestine, which is continued here. At this point, see how it kind of makes this weird S shape here? This portion is called the sigmoid colon. Sigmoid colon, because it looks like an S or a sigma. Sometimes they'll do a full colonoscopy. Other times they may just do a sigmoidoscopy. Sigmoidoscopy is just going to go through this bend here. Okay. A full colonoscopy is going to look at all of the colon. So this is the sigmoid colon. Now at this point, we see that it turns and goes straight down. This last portion of the colon is the rectum. The rectum. Now the rectum is going to end at the anal sphincter and at that point release feces. All right, so let's go over some of these other structures, make sure that we know them well. All right, cardiac valve, the right kidney, left kidney, the spleen, pancreas, the pyloric valve, the duodenum. This structure here is the bladder. This is the bladder. The kidneys function to form the urine. The urine is formed in the kidneys, and then it's going to travel through these white structures here called the ureters. The ureters. So this would be the right ureter and the left ureter. Both right and left ureters are going to drain into the bladder to store urine until it's ready to be released through the urethra. And that's everything you need to know for this model. Any questions?